She's not here.
Where is she? Did you hurt her?
Of course not.
Moments like this in haunting stories, like where someone finally realizes or someone finally is able to talk about it openly, deeply satisfying. Just from like a dramatic perspective, I eat this shit up.
I feel like the trope in most horror is that they don't come to terms with it. They continue to deny it until it's at its absolute worst.
But this house will make you a believer. Violet Harmon, meet Billie Dean Howard.
How many seasons are there where she doesn't smoke cigarettes? Sarah Paulson. There's not a single season where Jessica Lange doesn't.
That's a choice, right?
I feel like it's like a classic. It's absolutely a choice, but I feel like it's also like a classic Hollywood vibe, which is something that Ryan Murphy. It's very apparent in his passions.
I first found her on Craigslist. I don't understand you.
Wow. Those are some rough last words.
I remember when I watched this the first time, I thought she said,
Does that mean anything to you?
I don't understand you, I never will understand you. And I was like, that's fucking mean to say right at the end. But then she was talking about the parents. She said, they'll never understand you.
I'm not sure.
Which, like, I understand what Granny was going for, but that's bleak.
Urban legends, they terrify me.
I have a really hard time seeing him outside of his Modern Family role.
Yeah, he was supposed to be an asylum.
Really?
I believe he was supposed to be Killer Santa, I believe. And then they got Ian McShane instead, who I love. But this would have been a vibe.
Older brothers can be mean. They were younger. I see. Nothing else scares
Like,
me.
Ben also gets crazy intense cases. Like, these are people who should be in a hospital, like in an intensive treatment center.
I wonder if that's intentional. I wonder if that's the house. If it draws people with damage that it can manipulate.
And the house probably fucking loves it, because it's probably like feeding off of, like, these people are literally talking about their worst fears, and the house is like,
feed me, Seymour. Like,
Piggy.
yeah, this is the wrong house to do that in. He could be murdered at any point.
Like, no, he's not going to see the Piggy Man, but he's going to see something else that's going to traumatize him, and he's going to have to worry about that instead. Like, now he's going to be worried that a Piggy Man or a crazy dead nurse might try to kill him.
But he doesn't know that.
He's about to.
I hear the raw food movement is really taking off.
Mm-mm.
For the baby.
You couldn't have, like, cut it up so it didn't look like a brain? Just had to leave it.
Yeah, she's
intact.
Expected to do the dirt. Like, I couldn't imagine just being like, I'm cutting into a brain right now.
Yeah.
This brain used to tell something what to do.
I'm eating emotions.
She feels so guilty that it was so good. That's actually the appropriate response.
Yeah, right?
To that note, that's the appropriate response.
Do you ever check behind the shower curtain when you go into a bathroom?
Not anymore.
I still do, usually. Even just a quick glance, just like I'm aware.
Like, my house is, I don't know, like, the doors are locked.
Yeah, I live around a lot of strangers in very close proximity. Like, I don't know anybody in my building, really, so I'm just always aware of, like, the vague possibility. Oh, that's unfortunate.
What the hell did you do? This is supposed to be a robbery. Now it's murder, you asshole.
You asshole!
Why would he know you're there? Again, just like another overly charged emotional reaction from a man.
And that nail polish.
That would be so hard to have a psychic friend.
Just because your dead daughter's mad at you. Now, why the hell would you say that to me?
That house is so extra.
Right?
I don't like that.
You mean Ben is a bad therapist?
That's a man who also hasn't worked on his trauma.
I just want to watch Evan Peters with a little spoon.
I want to be that big spoon. Oh.
I would be interested to learn about some famous psychics.
I kind of want to talk about urban legends.
It's a filthy goddamn horse shop.
Welcome to It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show, a trivia variety show for and by American Horror Story fans, where we take a sidewinding journey through topics inspired by episodes of American Horror Story. This is my best friend, Nathan Skethway, my sweet boy.
And this is my personal Grecian muse, Monique Quistorf.
A quick synopsis of what this podcast is about, how it's structured. Nathan and I watch an episode of American Horror Story. We've been watching them in chronological order, starting with Murder House. And from that episode, we find a topic that inspires us that we can teach each other more about and also teach you more about. We also find a movie to watch that is connected to the topic that we've chosen from the episode, and we talk about that. And what that looks like is Nathan. After watching this week's episode of American Horror Story, I was inspired to watch Dark Water, directed by Walter Salles, debuted in 2005.
I've never seen this one.
So we've touched on this before, that there are, and this is a universal experience, movies that sink into your psyche, just become a part of your human structure. This is one of those movies for me. So I watched this probably when I was too young to watch this movie, but it has since created what I would consider to be an irrational fear. I don't know how much to give away, especially if this is a movie you'd ever would want to see. I won't give away like the twist at the end. It's about the haunting of a child left behind by her parents who drowned in the water tower on top of her apartment building. And so there's a lot of water theme, dripping from the ceiling, brown water in the faucets, dripping in the elevator. She has a supernatural capability to control water, and also her body is poisoning the water tank of this apartment building. So, that's that whole concept of water, right? The substance that we use to clean ourselves, clean our dishes, to make our food, to nourish ourselves, being tainted by, this disgusting, a dead human body. That image, that idea, that notion has been stuck with me ever since I watched this movie. Again, probably when I was too young to have to think about the possibility of this happening. I took notes this week while I was watching it. Just things that my brain questions about, things that my brain felt infuriated by. There's a water spot on the ceiling of the room that they move into, and there's there's a whole plot around the water spots. But now for me, since seeing that movie as a young person, kind of can never look at water spots the same, especially the water coming out of the water spot in the movie. It's dark and black, and it almost has the hint of that's not there's a decaying body right there, which is also another fear to have, is someone in your apartment building, someone above you, someone near you dying, and then their body leaking through the floor onto your stuff. This movie also has more maternal horror. It's the story of a mother and daughter who move into this apartment because dad cheated on mom, and now there's kind of that adjacent trope of absent father. And I think the one thing that really just got there were many things about this movie where I'm negligent. These are negligent things, but this mom she discovers the child's body in the water tower, but she goes out at night. She goes out at night to look in the water tower, and I know I know that it would have been 1,000 times more disturbing, but I didn't appreciate that when you see the child in the water, it looks like she literally just drowned. You know?
Yeah.
Like,
that's not how that works.
No, she wouldn't be pristine. She would be below, like, I mean, nobody wants to see a child look like that, but I was like, that's not even scary. You know? But that in and of itself is a real life horror. There's also like a touch of like elevator horror, which I feel like is such a specific genre of horror, but like so real. I think everybody at some point has felt afraid or unsafe in an elevator. That I think is a universal experience, a universal fear. And it is directly related to one of the, well, to the theme of the topics that I chose this week. So this week I'm talking about urban legends. And to start us off, I will be talking about a real life story where someone's body ended up in the water reserve for a hotel. Do you remember or did you hear about the young woman Elisa Lam who was found?
Oh yes.
Yes? Okay. So here's an in-depth story describing this incident.
I love this story.
Well, and contribute where you can. I mean, I kind of like I included a lot of information because it's so curious. So, I mean, just for background, let's pay our respects. She was born on April 30th in 1991 in Vancouver, Canada, and she was the daughter of immigrants from Hong Kong. At the time of her death, she was a student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. So she embarked on a trip to California, traveled alone on Amtrak and intercity buses, and she arrived in Los Angeles on January 26th. She checked into the Cecil Hotel and was initially assigned to share a room with the hotel on the hotel's 5th floor, but her roommates complained about what the lawyer would later describe as certain odd behavior, and she was moved to a room where she could be by herself. So if any of you had your little ears perked by the mention of Cecil Hotel, this is the hotel that inspired the season of Hotel, the American Horror Story season of Hotel. And just there are, I mean, the amount of deaths that have happened in the Cecil Hotel, we could talk for hours about the Cecil Hotel alone. But just some like notable things. In 1964, Goldie Osgood, the pigeon lady of Pershing Square, was raped and murdered in her room at the Cecil, a crime that has never been solved. Serial killers Jack Unterweger and Richard Ramirez both resided at the Cecil while they were actively murdering people. And there have also been suicides, one of which killed a pedestrian outside of the front entrance of the hotel.
Oh my god, I didn't know that. Like a falling kind of suicide?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. So, I mean, but there, if you ever look, and there is a Wikipedia page for horrific deaths that have happened at the Cecil Hotel. Someone probably could just make a podcast about that. But I thought I would put a little background information there because I figured some people's ears would be perked by the mention of that hotel. It's important to note that Elisa had been diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder. Her family did keep her mental health a secret, but they reported that she had no history of suicidal ideation or attempts, though there was a previous report that she had gone missing for a brief amount of time. So while Elisa had been on her trip away from Vancouver to California, she had called her parents every day. So when they didn't hear from her on February 1st, they contacted the LAPD to file a missing persons report. And a manager of a nearby bookstore was the only person who recalled seeing her on the day that she disappeared, and this person reported that Elisa was outgoing, very lively, and very friendly while getting gifts to take home for her family. So as a mental health professional, that is uncharacteristic behavior of someone who would be about to commit suicide. There wouldn't, there is no future planning except, to give things away. Saying goodbyes would be more of an indicator that there was something concerning going on, but her specifically picking out gifts to bring home is uncharacteristic of that concern. So that was February 1st. On February 19th, a maintenance worker discovered her body when investigating guest complaints of problems with the water supply and pressure. Some guests later claimed that their water was colored black and had an unusual taste. Tourists staying at the hotel bathed, brushed their teeth, and drank water from a tank in which Eliza's body was likely decomposing for more than 2 weeks.
Oh, God.
I think the reason, too, that, this case was so, it is a story right out of a movie. But if you remember, there's video surveillance of her in an elevator that went viral. They released it about 5 days before they found her body, and it went viral because she acts very peculiar in this video. She makes unusual moves and gestures. She leaves the elevator while the doors remain open, even though it looks like she has pressed every single button on the elevator. She's seen talking and gesturing in the hallway outside of the elevator, and is sometimes seeming to hide within the elevator. And when the doors fail to close after she returns, she leaves, and the doors close later. There are obviously lots of theories trying to explain this behavior. There are some speculations that she was trying to escape a pursuer, that someone was pursuing her and she was hiding in the elevator or trying to get away from them in the elevator. Some people suspect she could have been under the influence of drugs, though in the autopsy there was no drugs detected in her body other than her prescription medication. And of course, when people learned about her mental health, they speculated that there might have been an episode related to her bipolar disorder. There are also people who feel as though the elevator might have been the elevator surveillance might have been tampered with before it was made public. And I know that there was some mention of possibly there being a cut in the middle of the video, or at some point in the video, and that could be explained by another person entering the elevator who, for their privacy, would need to be removed to protect their identity. So that video and made the case much more viral. People heard a lot more about it and had a lot of questions. There are so many things that are curious about this case. So she was found naked in the tank with most of her clothes and personal effects floating in the water near her. But her phone was not found with her body or in her hotel room. There's some thought that it could have been stolen at the time of her death. But I'm so curious about this. Her stuff was floating with her in the tower. I can imagine, and there's more to explain, how she got in there, because there are some people who, those places are hard to get into for reasons, right? But if she was, even if she was having, a manic episode, and it got this idea in her head that she was going to take a dip in the tower, why would she bring her clothes with her? Why would she be and all my clothes are going to be wet with me?
Well, I remember reading or hearing somewhere that it occurs often when patients are hypothermic, that they try to remove their clothes, especially if you're in water. I can't remember what the exact reasoning for it is, but that it's that removing your clothes, especially because she's treading water in the tank, it could have been an attempt to just not get weighed down by her clothing.
So on February 21st, the LA Coroner's Office issued a finding of accidental drowning with bipolar disorder as a significant factor. They did do a toxicology test which showed traces consistent of her prescription medication that they found with her belongings in the hotel room. They did note that the concentration of prescription drugs in her system indicated that she was under-medicating herself or had stopped taking her medications recently. Another curious thing is it took the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office 4 months after repeated delays to release the autopsy report.
Did they give a reason?
No, not that I found. So the investigation had determined how Lam had died, but did not initially offer an explanation as to how she got into the tank in the first place. Doors and stairs that access the hotel's roof are locked, with only staff having the passcodes and keys, and any attempt to force them would have triggered an alarm. The hotel's fire escape could have allowed her to bypass those security measures. They, in her search, they had, police dogs looking for her, and her scent did get lost near a window that connected to the fire escape. A video posted after Lisa's death showed that the hotel's roof was easily accessible by the fire escape, and that the 2 lids of the water tanks were open, because those are very, very difficult to open if they're closed. So apart from how she got on the roof, people are curious about how she got into the tanks. All 4 tanks are 4 by 8 feet. They're cylinders propped up on concrete blocks. There are no fixed access to them, and hotel workers had to use a ladder to look at the water. There's not a ladder attached. You have a separate ladder you bring over to the tank to look inside. But police dogs also searched the roof for her, and even on the roof, shortly after her disappearance, they did not find any trace of her, any scent trace. So there's so many curious things. There are logical explanations, right? It's very possible that she stopped taking her medication, or she was giving herself low doses, had an episode, had an idea, but it's still, how did she get into the tank? I think I looked at pictures of the roof, and I guess there is a railing off to one side that you could feasibly climb up on and maybe propel yourself and pull yourself up to the top of the cylinder. And we'll never know. We'll never know. Is the part that really sucks about it. Is this was, because I remember hearing about this. Of course, it piqued my interest because it's such a replication of the plot in Dark Water. Something to tie this up with a pretty little bow. In 2015, the media speculated that the 5th season of American Horror Story was inspired by Elisa's death. In late spring, Ryan Murphy said the next season would be set in a hotel in present-day Los Angeles. He was inspired, he added, by a surveillance video of a young woman who got into an elevator at a hotel and was never seen again.
That's crazy. See, that's one of those urban legends, unlike Piggy Man in this week's episode, that actually legitimately creeps me out.
Well, Nathan, I've picked another kind of urban legend that I know freaks you out and freaks me out. And I've got a theme for the urban legends that I've chosen this week. It's called There's Something in the Water. So tell me what you know about Lake Lanier, Nathan.
Where is this?
In Georgia.
I feel like I've heard the name, but I can't tell you anything about it. So why don't you tell me what you know about Lake Lanier? So it's a reservoir in the northern portion of Georgia. It was created by the completion of the Buford Dam in the Chattahoochee River in 1956. The Army Corps of Engineers they built the whole thing, literally a whole army built this dam and created this lake to provide water and resources to Atlanta specifically, but also obviously surrounding communities, but it's very close to Atlanta. And it also provides flood protection from the Chattahoochee River. So the lake is 38,000 acres big, and it can hold about 625 billion gallons of water. It's 59 square miles of water. However we, I don't know. I can't fathom
visually
that.
Yeah, I'm like, what is 625 billion gallons, but it's big.
Yeah.
So before 1956, this is an area where people lived and had lived for generations and were asked if their land could be purchased to be used for this project. So roughly 700 families sold a total of 56,000 acres to the government. Local farms, cemeteries, and even a racetrack was submerged under Lake Lanier. An interesting fact, during an extreme drought in 2007, the grandstands of the half-mile track were uncovered. Like, you could see the underneath.
Wow.
Yeah. So Nathan, do you kind of get what this urban legend is, or is it giving you any vibes?
I feel like maybe that lake is deeply haunted because it's covering up an entire town.
Well, it's because it's I feel like it's more than, I mean, I'd have to do the research. There's the thing that kind of actually got me perked on this topic was in about, I think it was 2014, several different maps were found in an abandoned government building, and there were people who were affiliated with the project were asked, like, do you want these maps? And there was this person, and I wish I knew his name, I didn't write it down or anything, who was like, yes, give it to me. And it gives you so many different ideas of what that area looked like before the dam. I think it's several communities that were submerged, not just one town, but several. Okay, so to prepare the land, the Army Corps of Engineers demolished or moved anything that was considered dangerous. They uprooted trees and hauled them away. Wooden structures like barns that could float or endanger watercraft were moved. Major infrastructure such as bridges and water intakes were also relocated. But, as I previously mentioned, there were cemeteries in these communities. And while the Army Corps of Engineers identified and moved marked graves, it's likely that some unmarked ones were inadvertently left behind. It's also important to note that this land once belonged to indigenous people as well. And there's an entire lore around those sacred places that just should never be fucked with. And what's really disheartening too about this is that's a lost culture now. I mean not just the people who were immediately displaced in the 1950s, but the history that had been there with the indigenous people, that's gone. All of that is erased. So you're right on the money about this being a haunted lake. Legend has it that the ghost of a long dead woman roams this lake in a flowing blue dress. There's also reports of mysterious arms reaching out for swimmers from the watery depths, and some people have claimed to hear church bells from a sunken church. So one of Lake Lanier's most popular urban legends involves a car wreck. According to the story, a Ford sedan carrying two women careened off a bridge in April 1958, so 2 years after the dam was built, and tumbled into the lake. Some say the ghost of one of the women, dubbed Lady of the Lake, wanders the bridge at night in a blue dress, lost and restless. There are updates to this story. So in 1990, skeletal remains inside a Ford sedan were hauled from the bottom of Lake Lanier and identified as Susie Roberts. Investigators found a watch stopped at the time 11:30, which was about the time the two women are believed to have been driving home from a dance in a nearby town. About a year after the accident, so 1959, the body of a different woman who was believed to have been one of the occupants in the car was found, like washed ashore, away from the accident site. Authorities now believe that woman's body is that of Delia Mae Parker Young. The decomposed body was buried, unidentified, in the 1970s after a local mortuary kept the remains for about 20 years.
Oh my God.
In the hope that someone would identify her. Yeah, they waited 20 years hoping that someone would identify her. And it was only until this car was found in 1990 where they were able to say, yeah, that was probably the other lady. That was probably the passenger in this car accident. There are also like other unsettling things about this lake. Divers have reported creepy sightings, like freaky catfish as big as a Volkswagen, which in 625 billion gallons of water. Yeah. I mean, if you think about like goldfish will get as big as the area you put it in, maybe the same is true for catfish, and they could just get freakishly big. YouTube is filled with divers showing videos of sunken houseboats and piles of debris in this lake. In 2017, longtime diver Buck Buchanan told local media that he sometimes felt body parts in the lake during his many excursions. His direct quote, "You reach out into the dark and you feel an arm or a leg and it doesn't move."
Oh no.
Between 1994 and October of 2020, 203 people have died in drownings and boating incidents at Lake Lanier.
Oh my God.
That's not even 30 years, Nathan. And 203 people died in this lake. So it's just like this huge amalgamation of, displacing generations of families, giving a water burial to indigenous culture and local culture, submerging unmarked graves in entire towns, entire communities, and then every death that has happened on the lake since it was built. I would be curious to know, and I wonder, I'm sure we can find this somewhere, but the total number of deaths since its construction. That number has to be astronomical.
And then you take into account all of the deaths that you could potentially factor in from the cemeteries and the indigenous people who lived there before. That is a body of water quite literally swimming with death.
Well, and I specifically wanted to talk about this subject because this is a fear that I think you and I have in common. Where we went to school, we lived on an environmental campus that had its own lake, that also has its own urban legend that there is a sunken houseboat at the bottom of the lake, and it always freaked me out to think about. Anywhere, it freaks me out to think about the things you cannot see that are down there, like histories and stories.
I'm fascinated by shipwrecks. For that reason,
I'm freaking myself out right now just thinking about kayaking on top of Pine Lake, which I did many times, and just that unbridled fear of the depth that's beneath you and the
exactly, because it was so dark. It felt like you were floating on top of a void, and it was that complete unknowing of what was. I don't know how deep was the lake,
because it's a glacial lake. There were parts of it that were over 100 feet deep. So there were parts of it that were incredibly deep. And I think that too also freaks me out, because it's you don't know which part of it is that deep. And if, this tiny boat structure that we're sitting inside just decides, something happens, you don't know. I can't think too hard about something's history, a lake's history, without being no thanks.
Yeah. Wow. Terrifying. Okay, well, I think we are going to briefly go to commercial break, and then we'll be back with lots more spooky content, so stick with us through this brief message, and we will be right back. As you may know at this point, we don't have sponsorships here at It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show. Instead, I'm going to tell you about the Broadway Advocacy Coalition. I've spoken a little bit about this before, but in my regular life, I design posters and ad campaigns for Broadway shows, and the industry is just beginning to go through a long-needed period of change. The Broadway Advocacy Coalition is an organization uniting artists, experts, students, and community leaders to use storytelling and artistry to combat systemic racism. The group was founded in 2016 and has since become a Tony-winning organization that champions criminal justice reform, education equity, and liberation within the theater industry. Their work has included forums on industry reform, scholarship programs, and the Reimagining Equitable Productions workshop, which aim to help theater productions and theater companies create safe, inclusive theater spaces. If you want to get involved, head over to their website at bwayadvocacycoalition.org to donate or to check out their numerous programs.
So, I was inspired by the first appearance this week of our Queen and Savior, Sarah Paulson, who plays Billie Dean Howard, a psychic in this season of American Horror Story. And I started doing some research into famous psychics and landed on the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who I have read a fair amount into before, but was particularly interested in finding out some things that I hadn't found out. So the movie that I decided to watch this week was The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It, which is the most recent film in the Conjuring saga. It's also the first one that's not directed by James Wan, who directed the first two. The director of this one, Michael Chavez, who did the La Llorona film that just came out like 2 years ago, something like that. He did such an amazing job with this movie, and with a script that very easily could have been weird. There are a lot of strange elements in this one, just a lot of, I mean, it takes place during the early 80s, so they're starting to get into sort of the satanic panic fad of the time, that everybody was convinced that there were devil worshippers everywhere, and everything was down to that. But his directing style, just the way that he handles visuals, certain shots and certain angles, different lighting moments, it was so beautifully done, and kind of it I don't know, the best way I think to describe it is just very conscious directing. Like, it wasn't functional in the way that I think a lot of the time when a series is started by a specific director with a specific style and then someone else takes over, they're kind of just like trying to not rock the boat too much and just kind of trying to keep it within the same style, and as a result it sort of ends up feeling not cheap but a bit like an imitation. But I think he was good about doing his own thing with it, so it does feel a little bit different in visuals and tone from the first two, but it's not a bad change. But if you don't know anything about the case at the core of the third Conjuring movie, it deals specifically with the Arnie Johnson case, in which the Warrens were called to exorcise a demon from an 11-year-old boy named David, played by Julian Hilliard from The Haunting of Hill House, who played young Luke in it, and he's fantastic. But during the exorcism, the demon allegedly fled David's body and entered Arnie Johnson, who was a teenager, and then Arnie went on to stab his landlord, Alan Bono, to death during an argument, and then claimed to have absolutely no recollection of it. And essentially what the Warrens argued, and what was then argued for the first time by a defendant on trial, was that Arnie was possessed by the same demon that had possessed David, and that it jumped into Arnie during the exorcism, and that is what led him to commit the crime that he did. So it was the first time that a defendant had claimed not guilty by reason of demonic possession. Solid performances across the board. I mean, I love Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson. They're fantastic in the roles of the Warrens, as always. So yeah, this is the most recent case to be adapted for the Conjuring universe, which follows the Warrens and their investigations. But I was particularly interested in some of the cases that haven't been adapted for the screen yet, or adapted into not necessarily a film for the Conjuring universe, but there are, I mean, plenty of other movies that are based on their cases. But I did find one particularly interesting one that has not been adapted, and it also feels relevant to this season, as it is the story of a teenage girl accidentally falling in love with a ghost and it not ending well. So, a little background on Ed and Lorraine Warren. They were paranormal investigators and demonologists. They were mostly active between the 1950s and the 1990s. They investigated reports of hauntings and possessions all over the world. Some of their more famous cases that you've probably heard of are the Amityville haunting, which we talked about a little bit earlier this season, the story of the cursed Annabelle doll, which has been made into a movie, and like I said, all of the films in the Conjuring universe. There was even one interesting case where a man in England began to exhibit signs, or exhibit basically symptoms of being a werewolf, just like werewolf-like behavior, to the point that he attacked several bystanders, including a police officer. And when the Warrens were called in, they had an exorcism and determined that he was being possessed by a quote-unquote wolf demon. And during the exorcism, multiple bystanders and witnesses reported seeing him begin to transform into something that looked like a werewolf before the demon left his body.
That's a kind of demon I don't think I've ever heard of. I've never heard of a subtype of demon before. I mean, it's like an animal-centric specific.
Me neither. That was an interesting one.
Wolf demon.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of their cases got a lot of publicity as a result. They were also fairly good at getting themselves publicity. They went on a lot of talk shows. And it was actually about a 20-minute long interview that I watched to get a lot of the information for the case that I'm going to tell you about, and that is the Donovan case. So the Donovan case hasn't been made into any particular movie or anything yet, but this takes place in 1973 in West Hartford, Connecticut. It centers on the Donovan family, who lived on a property which bordered a monastery. The family's made up of Ted, the father, Ellen, the wife, Brian, their 15-year-old son, and their 19-year-old daughter, Patty Donovan. Now, Patty, she's a bit of a loner. She doesn't have very many friends, kind of like Violet in American Horror Story. Her parents are very strict, and they keep her on a short leash. And she's also frequently described as not being the brightest, and as such, to deal with her loneliness, she begins to play with a Ouija board. And with her Ouija board, she reaches out and asks if there's anyone there, because she's lonely and she's looking for a friend, and the board says yes. So over the next year, Patty begins to communicate and have a regular communication relationship with what seems to be the spirit of a teenage boy her age. Kind of became an imaginary friend of sorts, although maybe not so imaginary. But they began to exchange secrets, and Patty even began to view this spirit as her boyfriend. So in February 1974, Patty's had enough of her not being able to see her invisible boyfriend, and she asks the spirit to manifest in some way. She wants proof that he exists other than just these Ouija board communications. And the next morning, they discover that both Patty's car and her father's car won't start, no matter what they try. They take both cars to the local mechanic, who tells them that in Patty's father's car, spark plugs have been unhooked and the fan belt has been severed. On top of more damage, there's a ton of things that are just not where they're supposed to be. And in Patty's car, the parts inside the engine have been taken apart. The engine hasn't been taken apart, and you would have had to take apart the engine to do what's been done to it, but it literally looks as if someone took apart the engine, went in and messed up all of the little parts within the engine itself, and then closed it back up.
That's a lot of effort and energy for a ghost to put in. That's a lot of energy for a human.
Yeah. We're talking a ghost who knows cars. Or just opened them up and was like, whew, what can I fuck with? But in the following week, more things begin to happen. And this is the beginning of a long and grueling chronicle of damage that happens to the family home. Shrubs are ripped out of the flower beds. The doorbell is ripped out of the wall. An iron pipe on the roof is suddenly bent 90 degrees with no explanation. Patty's car gets a flat tire. She changes out the flat tire, and it immediately gets another one and looks as if it's been stabbed. Fearing that their house is being vandalized, that they're being tormented by someone, Ted, her father, calls the police, but the police are of no help. And Patty, who is concerned that her requests for her ghost boyfriend to manifest has resulted in what's going on, keeps going back to the board to ask, why are you doing this? What's going on? But the board just keeps saying goodbye and won't give her any other answer besides that.
So her ghost boyfriend was really upset that she asked him to prove himself.
Yep, right? Shouldn't have to prove my love. One night, Ted and Ellen are questioning 15-year-old Brian about some of the damage because, searching for an explanation. They're like, obviously our teenage son, it's got to blow off some steam. Maybe he's just breaking shit around the house. But while they're in the middle of questioning him, they hear a loud bang from somewhere inside the house. And when they go to investigate, they find a gaping 18-inch hole in the wall of Brian's bedroom. And the wood pieces and the pieces of the wall are bent inward away from the room, which means that whoever did it had to have done it from the inside. But it's an 18-inch hole, so that's you have to use something to do that. But there was absolutely no explanation for why this hole just showed up in the wall.
It's really convenient for the ghost to clear Brian's like Brian is innocent, not Pierce. Just really convenient,
right?
Very helpful, considerate.
Refuses to share credit for his hijinks. In the weeks following, the incidents begin to ratchet up. There are scratching noises all throughout the house, but they can't find a source for them. They deal with several more flat tires and additional car damage. One of the biggest things that begins to happen is loud bangs coming from inside the house, but they can't figure out where they're coming from. Ted even spent an entire day looking for the source of the banging. This was on a day that the pressure valves on all the radiators had turned off by themselves when nobody was home. So he called a repair person being like, what the fuck is going on? And the repair person even heard the banging while it was going on. And the two of them searched for hours and hours. It was something like 18 hours. And they couldn't find anything that would have been causing it. Nothing to do with the pipes, nothing to do with the furnace, nothing. There were also moments where obscenities and blasphemies would show up written on the walls. Poor 15-year-old Brian was blamed for this a lot of the time, but there were times when it would show up when it couldn't have been him, where he wasn't even home. So that's all throughout February and into March. And then on March 31st, there's an incident where Ted and Ellen are in their room at night watching TV. And all of a sudden, the lights go on and off 3 times, and then the TV turns off. And then objects throughout the room, including a chair covered with clothes and a 250-pound dresser, reportedly levitated.
Wow.
Pictures flew off of the walls, and most upsettingly to me, they reported hearing from somewhere in the house the sound of a meowing kitten that then transformed into a crying baby. But they chose not to look into that. They didn't go see what that was, and I don't know that I blame them.
I mean, honestly, this might be cut out, but I've been seeing a lot of, TikToks about, if you're in, the Appalachian Mountains and you hear crying, or if you hear your name, but, if you hear a baby crying, you don't, and you just have to ignore it. The sound of a cry...
Wait, why?
Oh, that's, maybe a whole lore that we can get into, but, they're saying like Wendigos. but that's what that reminds me of if you hear a crying baby. I mean, and what, just from my back of the hand amateur demonology that I have from all of the horror that I've absorbed, anything that sounds like a child, anything that sounds helpless, innocent, don't. That's exactly like the hook that they're using to get your attention, to make yourself vulnerable in that situation.
I guess it's lucky that they had been dealing with a whole host of things up until that point, because I can't imagine that after your lights start going crazy and a 250-pound dresser levitates, that you're going to hear a kitten and be like, oh, we got to go find it. At that point, I'm like, fuck that.
That's what, in my mind, that's what you start with, because I would be like, hell yeah, let's look for this kitten.
Yeah.
But it's so creepy to me that, it started as a kitten, where, any, I think an average person would want to, especially if it sounds like it's coming from your home, you're going to want to find that thing. But the spirit was like, this is obviously not working. Now it's a crying baby. You can't ignore the sounds of a crying baby. That's unsettling.
So, moving on to April Fool's Day. It was on April Fool's Day that year that, for the first time of many times, It rained rocks on this house. This first time, it happened for about an hour. And this is kind of a thing that shows up in a lot of horror movies and books. Stephen King likes to use it sometimes, like the concept of rocks falling, especially on a haunted house. And it's always kind of struck me as just like a little bit too far. But in this particular case, it was witnessed by the police.
Wow.
Who then, understandably, given their limited capacity as police officers in the face of raining rocks, were basically like, we can't help you. You might want to call a priest. So that night, the family goes and they stay at a hotel. But unfortunately, whatever is tormenting them follows them to the hotel, and they experience the same pounding noises. At one point, they leave their room to go have breakfast, and when they come back, the room has been trashed. And this is something that also is happening in their house. They're often coming home to find things, rooms completely torn apart, or things moved or knocked over or not where they're supposed to be. So this even happens in the hotel when they're staying there. So they return to their home, and when they get back, the place has been utterly trashed. There is food and liquid dumped all over everything, the rugs, the beds, the furniture. There's more upsetting writing all over the walls. The furniture's been turned over and broken. There are towels stuffed in the toilets. Just, I mean, damage on a massive scale.
I'm imagining, like, witnessing these things in the act. Like, how that would... Like, that's an undertaking to put all the food and all the liquids on the floor. Like, I'm just imagining watching that happen as it happens.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what that must have been like in that somewhat empty house when they were gone and this damage is being done. But it's after this point that the Warrens finally get involved. A monk from the monastery next door gave them the phone number for the Warrens. I guess it's one of those lucky times to live next to a monastery when the monk next door happens to know the most famous demonologist in the country. So they get in touch with the Warrens, and they're on the West Coast, so it's going to be about a week before they can come back. And in that week, several more instances of rocks raining on the house. Religious icons are destroyed or hidden throughout the house. The refrigerator moves into the center of the kitchen on its own 2 separate times. Patty's hi-fi set lifts into the air and then smashes on the ground. She gets a new one, and the new one does the same thing.
What's hi-fi?
A hi-fi was like an older type of sound system.
Okay.
There's a moment where, after reading scripture, they find in the basement that there's water flowing from a random point in a wall, but there are no pipes behind the wall. There's no source for the water to be coming from. And probably most disturbingly, Ellen, the mother, at one point turned around to find a black shadowy mass standing behind her that then dispersed and disappeared. So when the Warrens arrive, they're accompanied by Father Charbonneau, who was a noted priest at the time who had recorded, or at least reported recording, over 10,000 spirit voices while he was studying in Rome. He actually requested to come along and later said that the case was the most stunning thing that he'd seen. When they arrive, Lorraine describes feeling an overpowering evil in the house, and they're able to determine that the spirit that's haunting the Donovan family is not, surprisingly enough, is not the spirit of a teenage boy, but is an older, demonic, inhuman spirit posing as a teenage boy to get on Patty's good side. Isn't that the way? So Charbonneau performs an exorcism on the house, during which the house is felt shaking. All of the rooms are trashed all over again. At one point, Ed Warren receives 2 scratches on his arm that form the shape of a cross. And this particular time, they actually brought a film crew and cameramen along to record everything. In one instance, a cameraman was actually just about hit by a flying hairbrush that came like flying out of a room and whizzed right by his head, and then he ran from the house in fear and never returned. But yeah, they were filming this the entire time, and it was actually aired on local news channels. It was broadcast on like 3 separate occasions, but then after that the footage was destroyed. and you can't find it anywhere now. But during this interview that I watched with Ed and Lorraine, they talked about the fact that this was one of the cases where they talked about the extraordinary things that had happened and people didn't believe them, but then they were like, here's the footage to prove it. So it kills me that I can't find that footage anywhere now. But eventually, the exorcism that they perform on the house gets rid of the presence, so to speak, and the family is able to stay in the house. They actually still own it to this day. Patty's now married with 3 kids, but interestingly, the insurance company refused to cover any of the extensive damage on their house because, ironically, it was labeled an act of God, which is one of my favorite and least favorite insurance terms, but is particularly funny in this case. It was reported that a lot of the participants in the exorcism and in the general study of the house after the Warrens got there were affected for a very long time afterward. There was even another priest who was there on the exorcism who said for about 2 weeks or so, when he talked to the Warrens for about 2 weeks afterward, he felt like a presence had followed him from the house and was following him still. Ed and Lorraine continued to hunt for ghosts and help people out with their ghosty problems until the 90s. Ed died in 2006 and Lorraine later passed away in 2019, but you can still visit their home and their museum, which if you've ever watched the Conjuring movies, that big room that they put all of their artifacts and stuff in. It's not that big, it doesn't really look like that in real life, but it is a museum that you can visit and you can see the real life Annabelle doll and other various things from their career. And I would really like to visit it someday, not only because I'm fascinated by ghosts, but just because I'm fascinated by them. I don't know how much I believe of what they've always said over the course of their careers, but I am fascinated by the Warrens.
Who do you entrust your cursed item museum to after you pass? Like, who do you think is responsible enough to run a museum filled with, curses?
I would imagine it's some of their family members, because I know someone in Ed's family, I think it was like a nephew or something like that, studied with them and later went on to become a demonologist of his own, and they also just like took other people under their wing as apprentices and stuff like that during their time, assistants, things like that.
It's not just like a piece of it is psychic, right? The ability to be psychic, but there's also the other end of there is something to interact with. There are demons or spirits.
That's true. Those cases and those stories kind of are like, it asks you to believe 2 relatively unbelievable things, not only the existence of ghosts and then the existence of people who can talk to them and can see them, and I can't imagine being in that particular situation and not only having to confront that because your house is haunted, but then also having to trust someone else who claims that they can help, but it's still in a way that you can't see and you can't understand the way that they can.
Well, that you hope that they can, that the person that you're dealing with is legit. And I think, well, that's the question, Nathan. Well, how much of this do you believe?
I go back and forth on this sometimes, especially with the Warrens. Like I said, I love them and I'm fascinated by them, but as I also said, they were very good with publicity. There are a lot of reports with their various cases of the possibility of details being inflated or entirely made up just for the sake of creating a story. But it's the amount of eyewitnesses in some of these cases, and this case specifically, that gets my interest, especially with the rocks. Like the fact that the police witnessed stones raining on the house. What possible explanation can you have for that? So I don't know. While a lot of the time I would lean toward at least being open to the possibility of ghosts, if not outright believing in them, I do struggle with the idea of people who claim to be able to communicate with them. But having said that, I think maybe were I in that case and the existence of ghosts had been proven for me without a doubt, as it was for poor sweet Patty, I think I would not find it as much of a leap to then also believe a psychic.
Well, and I think that's the situation. It's unbelievable until it happens to you. And I even think with because it's not just believing in ghosts. It's believing in ghosts and demons or inhuman spirits, because that's like, sometimes for me, that's, I don't know, I feel like it's easy for me to believe in ghosts. I feel like as human beings, we have energy that can leave a residual impact. But the idea that there is another further realm, I mean, I believe it, but my brain is also deeply, deeply discomforted by the idea. And the idea of psychics, I am open to the idea, but I would definitely need to be convinced. And yeah, but if you experience something like this, where poor Patty, this is why you do not mess with Ouija boards. Do not use them in your home. You do not know what you're calling to. You have no idea what's coming through, and it's not your boyfriend, Patty. It's an old man. It's an old demon. It's an old entity posing as a brooding young boy. I would love to visit the Warren Museum with you. Where's that located?
Connecticut.
Oh, that's not too far from things.
We could absolutely do that.
Nathan, I think it's about time that we have a little twist ending.
A little twist ending. Let's do it.
A good portion of this week's episode of American Horror Story, focuses on one of Ben's patients who has a phobia. His phobia is a phobia of urban legends. So I thought I would talk about some phobias that I know I've never heard of, that I also doubt you've heard of before too. So just to start things off, a definition of a phobia is a marked fear or anxiety about a specific object or situation that can lead to clinically significant distress. This is not just like, oh, I don't like spiders, or spiders give me the heebie-jeebies. It's, you are fundamentally changing your life to avoid experiencing the thing that you are afraid of, or being even triggered to have to acknowledge the thing that you're afraid of. If it's significantly impacting your everyday life, because you experience an emotional reaction that you cannot physically handle, that is a phobia. So there's the phobia of phobias, which is phobophobia. And I love that I've chosen phobias that I literally cannot pronounce. I have to put in the pronunciation. Arachibutyrophobia is the fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth.
Not to be disrespectful to anybody with arachibutyrophobia, but that's a good one.
It's oddly specific. Siderophobia, fear of stars or the expansiveness of the universe. Dextrophobia, fear of having objects to your right. I think it's geliophobia, fear of laughter. Xanthophobia, fear of the color yellow. Cathesophobia, fear of sitting down. Nomophobia, fear of not having a mobile phone. Alluophobia, fear of flutes.
Relatable.
And calagenophobia or venistrophobia, fear of beautiful women.
That's fascinating. I've never heard of any of those. Those are all new to me.
Well, and I mean...
except for phobophobia.
I mean, theoretically, it's kind of like the internet. If you can imagine it, it exists. If you can imagine it, someone could have a phobia of it, It's... I think the real curious part of any phobia is how they're developed. If it's a traumatic event, or if it's just something that kind of gets stuck in your head in the wrong way, as a part of your development that you can't quite shake, or if it's part of a different mental health condition. But yeah, those are some phobias that I did not know. Thank you for joining us this week. We hope that you enjoyed learning about the American horror genre and the history that inspired the genre of American horror. If you like what you heard this week, please subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts.
You can also find us on TikTok at Filthy GD Horror Show, Instagram at Filthy GD Horror Show, Twitter at Filthy GD Horror, and on YouTube. You can also email us your questions, your suggestions, anything that you want to reach out and say. Please keep insults to a minimum, but if you want to reach out to us, you can find us at filthygdhorrorshow@gmail.com.
Please consider donating to our featured charity this week. Links to that can be found in the episode description. This show isn't sponsored by this or any other organization. We just like to shout out good people doing good things.
Now, if you have not watched the most recent episode of the new season of American Horror Story, Season 10 double feature, this is the end of the line. This is the end of the road. Please turn off this podcast, or it's not our fault if you end up spoiled. Otherwise, stay tuned for our reactions to Double Feature and tune in next week where we will be exploring Episode 7 of American Horror Story Murder House on...
It's a filthy goddamn horror show.
Oh boy, American Horror Story Season 10 double feature Episode 5 Gaslight, appropriately titled. What'd you think, Monique?
Everything that we've been speculating from the beginning came true.
Indeed it did, and yet it was no less upsetting to see it happen. My God, I feel a little bit traumatized.
Although the thing, okay, so maybe I'm going to start off by talking about the thing that I didn't necessarily expect to happen, and that was the runner with Karen and Mickey. And of course, this is, the last thing, one of the last things that we see in this episode, so maybe I'm still just processing it, but it is kind of deeply poetic that she just took him out and took herself out. And I'm willing to bet, even though we didn't get to see in this episode, I'm willing to bet that the pill did in fact work for her, and she painted a masterpiece and left it there on the beach and just let her body wash away.
I wonder if we'll see it in the next episode.
I hope that we do, but I think it's just as well to leave it as something that's left to our imagination.
Yeah, there is something very poetic about us not getting to see it, and it just being something for her, for the character, like that. I find that very beautiful.
Karen must be the only character from this season who actually sticks to her convictions.
Yeah, except for Ursula, who is just kind of in it for the money from the beginning and doesn't seem to waver from that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, people can have bad convictions that they also stick to.
Yeah.
And that is Ursula to a T.
But yeah, she's the only one that up until the end, even though she kills Mickey on the way out, retains her conviction that it's not worth it. She has that beautiful moment, that line with Mickey that says, "Don't you understand? I don't care. It doesn't matter to me if I'm not good enough or if I am. The price of this is not worth it." And yeah, I think it was really, really beautiful that they kept her to that until the end. A strange character, Tuberculosis Karen. And overall, a strange arc, a strange inclusion in the season, kind of a weird character to give Sarah Paulson. I mean, they really made the most of it, and they gave her some beautiful scenes, but as a character in itself, it was just, she was an odd one, but R.I.P. TV Karen.
I almost feel like she's one of the best characters of this season, just because
I would agree.
I do think that they gave Sarah Paulson a fantastic opportunity to perform, not outside of her wheelhouse, but outside of what we've been exposed to so far. But to do it, I mean, to be such a beautiful person with such a, I don't know, I mean, I feel like this episode really did do a wonderful tribute to the beautiful character that TB Karen has, despite, everything else in her life not being beautiful.
Yeah, I agree.
We, unfortunately, also got to witness Alma being the most evil child.
Good God, she has a talent.
Actually, you know what? I was gonna say she's got a talent for manipulation, but if I'm being entirely honest, it was all a little transparent. I think Doris is just stressed, and also is the only one who is not entirely in the loop, which is a stressful situation for anybody. So it's easy to confuse someone, I would imagine, in that scenario. But good God, this little girl.
I mean, this is why they call this episode Gaslight, because the entire episode is Doris being manipulated to be left out of this, what's becoming this family enterprise. And then, of course, Alma is devastatingly manipulative to get her mother to take the pill because she knows that her mother is mediocre and she wants her mother to be gone. And so we get to witness this transformation of Doris into a pale person. This season, I think, has given so many American Horror Story actors, I think, have gotten maybe the most interesting, complex characters to play. You know, we've seen Lily Rabe since season 1 play all different kinds of people.
Yeah, you're right. Lily Rabe has done interviews recently and gone on record talking about how much she appreciated the experience of filming this season because of the fact that with the way that the story is structured and the way that the scenes are structured, they got to have a lot of these very intimate one-on-one scenes, especially her and Finn, who have both been a part of the show for years. So she was like, we've both been on the show, but we've never really gotten to work super directly with each other, and now we got to spend this whole half a season filming these like incredibly intimate, emotional, tense, terrifying scenes in this one location. And she said it was an incredible experience. But then with this episode specifically, she also said that it was both her favorite episode to shoot and also the most painful and the most difficult, which understandable. I mean, like, props to her for that, especially that moment at the end in the graveyard. Terrifying. And the full makeup and everything. I mean, she really went for it, and I was wildly impressed by Lily Rabe in this episode and the season in general. I hope we see more of her.
Yeah, I can't imagine she wouldn't be in the finale. They would be leaving out an integral storyline of this half of the season.
Frances Conroy continuing to be spectacularly awful as Belle Noire, and by awful I mean in like a moral sense. She's killing it, Frances Conroy herself. I mean, just consistently killing it. But she didn't have to stamp on her painting. Like, just awful all around.
In that moment when that scene happened, I had to remind myself, like, oh, the pill makes her hate everyone who isn't as good as her. Because I think, you know, with the previous episode, we were exposed to her backstory to see what kind of sweet, innocent, and meek woman she was, to go to this of, like, destroying another person's artwork. This genuine person who just wants to paint on the beach and doesn't want to snatch a newborn baby from a family that she's acquainted with. You know, like, she just wants to live her life, and Belle Noire can't get enough of that sweet newborn baby blood. Which we also got to see in this episode. Alma, you know, suckling on the little foot of her baby brother.
Haunting, that scene. Just, it's such a deep level of twist, and I was so afraid that's where it was going, but when I saw it, I was like, I can't believe she's actually fucking doing that. It's so bad. That and Harry at the beginning with the bloody towels from his...
For me, that was like a level of fiending that was too graphic for my personal liking. But Alma might be the creepiest child that we have seen in the American Horror Story franchise. At least, I mean, we're going to get the opportunity to rewatch a lot of things that I may have forgotten, but I don't know if I've ever been unsettled this much by a child character. I do feel a little sad that Macaulay Culkin has become deceased within the American Horror Story universe.
Same. I know they announced the cast for the next half of the season, and I know he's not featured, but I hope he comes back in the next half, and then if he doesn't, he had better come back in subsequent seasons, because just a gem. A real gem of an actor, and I imagine a human being. He just seems wonderful. But yeah, R.I.P. to Mickey, who got to wear those fabulous pants for one episode.
It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is created by Monique Quistorf and Nathan Skethway. Nathan also edits and mixes our show.
To find out about the music used in this episode, check out our website at filthygdhorrorshow.com. It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is a podcast created by American Horror Story fans and is in no way affiliated with the show.